So I was hoping to attract a little bit of a crowd with a contrarian message, and I can see that's worked out exactly the way I was hoping. You know, we came from kind of an education technology background, and one of the interesting things about that is that you encountered this perception in enterprise computing that sort of second tier, it's bush league, and that and for the most part that's true. You know, if you look at edutech solutions, they're lower quality UI, they're lower stability requirements, they're just sort of it's a different bar for quality that you see in education. And what we think is interesting about the space that we're in is that it turns out that education is actually running far ahead of what enterprise is doing, and it's almost a cultural difference. So I want to walk through sort of some of what we're seeing on both sides of the fence. So I want to cover just the use cases that we think are shared between the two groups, and sort of talk through what those are, and then talk about sort of the video challenges that people see in enterprise and how solutions like Panopto can solve them, and then talk a little bit about sort of the success stories of people who have sort of embraced this idea of software-based commodity video recording technology, sort of video for all, democratization of this kind of tech, and what it's done for their companies. So what are some of the things that people want to be able to do with video? Well, in the enterprise, one of the basic ones is being able to record a presentation like this one. So this is actually a challenging presentation recording configuration. So just out of curiosity, you guys capturing my screen? You're not, are you? Yeah, that's tough, actually. So here I am in the front of the room. I've got a lot of animation. I've got slides. I've got lots of content that my computer's generating, but it's not being captured because apparently it's not part of this talk. So actually it's not being captured, not because these guys are bad, because it's really tough. And so, of course, there's the video feed in the back of the room. Now, this is something that I don't think the reason it's not being captured is because it's without value. It's just something that has not become kind of a baseline for how you capture an instructional presentation. So that's one use case. Another one is just capturing meetings. So if you're having a meeting where you're doing a design review, or you're coming up with, you're brainstorming something, you're planning through something, and there's any possibility that somebody might want to come back to this later, either because they're in a different continent, you want to time shift it, they can't attend in real time, because somebody wants to come back and review it, somebody missed it. All these cases where you've got kind of sort of ad hoc knowledge creation. It's something that isn't a formal meeting, but there's some value to it. And so this is another place where we think that there's a significant demand in the enterprise, but it's sort of an unmet demand. And then there's kind of the bread and butter enterprise use case, just getting video from point A to point B, delivering video around the world. And then finally, sort of subject matter expertise capture. And this is kind of the domain of things traditionally sort of low-end screen capture tools, screen plus audio, just being able to sort of knock something out quickly and send it out to a small team and give them something that a little bit more visual than a memo or an email. So as you look at these use cases, just some things to think about. I probably could just poll this room, but how much video are enterprises capturing today? The numbers are actually pretty small for most enterprises. It's the low hundreds of hours of content per year. And what's the cost of that? Well, traditionally, this is sort of a big iron kind of thing. When I was at Microsoft a couple of years ago, if you wanted to capture like a tech talk or a brown bag, you had to call up the AV team. They would send somebody in, they had a camera that looked kind of like this. It had a tape. It was you would call in the troops. So it tends to be pretty expensive stuff. Now you get high quality out of it, but it's a very high, kind of a high barrier to justify bringing in all that AV equipment. And what's the cost of the AV hardware? And if you want to do something like an international sales meeting, or you want to have the kind of dreaded capture scenario, a multi-track day-long event, actually what we're doing right here, what's the cost of doing that? And what kind of teams do you need? What's the post-production requirement? How quickly can you get it online? And really the question, what if your CEO came to you and said, we want you to capture 10 times as much video as you're capturing today? Does that terrify you guys? I know you're from education, but that should terrify most people who are doing sort of traditional video capture in the enterprise. So it turns out that in higher ed, all of these use cases exist. They exist at massively larger scale, but they have different names that don't resonate with the enterprise market. So in education, the presentation capture slide, that's just called lecture capture. And the kind of informal meetings, those are just labs, and they're sort of informal training sessions, things like reviews and TA sessions. And then delivering video to remote locations, well, that's just called distance learning. And in higher ed, the volumes of capture are extraordinary. They're sort of off the charts by enterprise standards. You've got Newcastle University. They went from basically a standing start, not capturing anything with Panopto, to capturing 10,000 hours in 4 months. It was the fastest ramp-up time of any customer we've ever seen. And this isn't just like random, video of empty classrooms. This is all driven by a scheduling system. Every single one of these hours is a high-value classroom instruction to usually a live audience. So, this is not just sort of somebody flipped a switch and now there's a lot of stuff. This is actually the sort of collected educational output of Newcastle University. And you can even go up from there. Essex is doing 30,000 hours of capture per semester. That's a shocking amount of content. I mean, it's dozens of terabytes. And this is per semester, and they plan to do it in perpetuity. This isn't an experiment. So when you think about, what does it take to get to anybody who has video in the enterprise wants it, this is the kind of, these are sort of numbers that people should be thinking of and how they reach this sort of scale. So what are the challenges that enterprise video faces that prevents it from reaching that kind of scale? Well, one of the answers is that it tends to be still sort of, and I hope you'll forgive me at a place like streaming media, but it tends to still be the domain of complex hardware. It's sort of the gatekeepers and the guys with the boxes and the $1 million rooms, and that's the way it's done. If you want to capture video, you have to go through these guys. Well, it turns out that the commoditization of camera technology, especially over the last 5 years, has really sort of erased this distinction. And of course there's optics and lighting and miking and so on, but between the sort of quality of video you can get from a webcam and what you can get from a higher end camera. Yes, of course, webcams don't look like high end cameras. There's all kinds of reasons why they don't. But if you just, if you put webcam video with good lighting and good framing in front of a non-technical user, they would say, yeah, that's pretty good. That's a high definition camera, right? Like, no, it's actually a $60 webcam. So the availability of this technology has kind of brought just the hardware side of it to everybody that wants it. And of course, the piece that has to pair with that is that these are just general purpose cameras. They're not recording systems. And so they don't produce things that are sort of artifacts that people typically expect. They have to produce sort of software produced video, and they should result in presentations. And that's where the kind of teams that do the post-production come in. So you have to find a way to automate not just the sort of capture using hardware, but the whole post-production process that's done by humans after something like this gets recorded. And this is what I was saying before, the sort of videographer dilemma, the logistical complexity of trying to get the video off of my laptop while I'm giving a presentation. Now this is not the presenter's laptop. This is one that I came into the room, I unplugged the cable, I plugged in my own, I'm using my own laptop. These guys didn't get a chance to install any software on it. how would we capture this stuff? So what a lot of companies tend to fall back on is just doing a lot of complicated wiring. You get a big box, you get something like a $25,000 media site box. You get some sort of fancy piece of hardware, and you run a bunch of expensive cables, and you sort of wire this thing up to be the smart room. And so yeah, now you're sort of equipped to handle somebody that walks in, drops their computer, and wants to present something. But to actually deal with this the right way, and to hit the kind of scale that you need to hit in education, we think that there's a novel solution, which is get rid of the wires. If you have a network, you can use a server as your point of synchronization. And now, as long as you're able to capture the content at each sort of point of creation, so there's a point of creation there with the camera, and that's being fed into probably a laptop. Or maybe it's just going to a memory card. And there's another point of creation here at the podium, which is where I'm presenting from. And so I've got my laptop, and this is actually not just a PowerPoint machine. It's a supercomputer that's doing nothing while I'm using PowerPoint. I've got 8 cores of an i7 CPU. This is a really high-end machine. And it's not doing anything except showing a PowerPoint slide. So can we do something better with that? Well, it turns out yes. We can compress and capture video at both locations. We can do it in real time. We can tell the server we're capturing the following streams, and they all share this timeline, and the server can put it all together. So another thing that sort of prevents organizations from reaching the scale that they should reach is that the content goes into all sorts of different places. You've got each department with their own kind of homegrown solution. In a lot of cases, it's a SharePoint with people uploading videos and sets of PowerPoint slides and managing access control themselves, and just all sorts of death by 1,000 cuts problems that prevent people from creating what they want to create. And what any organization that has knowledge workers sort of generating information all day long, those organizations should not be thinking about how do you create these silos by departments. They should be thinking about how do I create one massive archive of sort of the tribal knowledge of my organization. and to be able to search that and actually do something useful with it. So in education, that's called a campus-wide lecture capture system. So as I said before, there are cases where you have video scattered across the network into different file formats. It's in different organization schemes. There's no centralization. There's no search federation. And to solve this, you need a proper video content management system. And there are plenty of VCMSs in sort of the enterprise space. But I think it's an interesting test to go up to a VCMS vendor and say, what would you do with 100,000 hours of content a year? How would you scale to deal with that? What are you going to do to make sure that every new generation of capture devices, of mobile devices, is actually going to be served by the kind of video that you're creating? When there's a new form factor, how are you going to address that form factor? And it sort of becomes a terrifying problem. If you start with this, to get to that is a pretty daunting software challenge. So there's another issue, which is the network capacity. So if you talk to people in the enterprise about, well, I want to deliver video to, I have an organization of 100,000 people. It's spread around the world. There are different levels of network capacity in each of these offices. I don't want any saturation of these uplinks, but I want to make sure that everybody has full access to all this content. Well, this is kind of a holy grail of video delivery. That's why when you go into the room there and you look at the booths, everybody's talking about MPEG-Dash and adaptive streaming, kind of general video technology. So unless you have some way of dealing with network conditions, you might solve the form factor problem, but you haven't solved the network problem. So you have accessibility by device, but you're not accessible on everything from a dial-up connection, which I guess still exists, all the way up to a gigabit. So being able to give somebody not just the best experience on the device, but the best experience their network permits, that's, I think, a requirement of sort of modern video in the enterprise. And then finally, scale. So one of the questions we get when people get introduced to Panopto is, well, can you guys have a video conference with this? And we say, no, it's not video conferencing, it's something else. Well, the something else is actually a technology decision. So if you want to have low latency, kind of immediate live collaboration, there's a different kind of video compression technology you tend to gravitate to. And these barriers will be raised over time, but for the most part, if you look at unified communication systems like, for example, Cisco WebEx, they have a hard limit of the number of simultaneous participants. So if I, as the sort of technology, well, let's say I'm the CTO of a large enterprise, if I want to reach everybody in the organization with a live broadcast, I actually can't use something like WebEx. So what's above that? Well, GoToMeeting has managed to get this all the way up to 1,000 simultaneous viewers. That can handle some pretty big broadcasts, but it's not everybody in the organization. Connect is a little bit better, but if you really want to turn the dial all the way to the maximum, you need some different type of technology. You need something a little bit more like what Netflix does with sort of a CDN-based distribution of chunks of video, not having a synchronous connection, and you pay a cost for that. You have a little bit of latency that you introduce. But what you get in exchange is the ability to scale to basically an infinite number of viewers. The viewer count, the cap of the viewer count is actually the maximum capacity of the CDN. So going from sort of active, always on kind of live connections to a little bit more passive model with a bit more latency means that you can blow out your scale limit for the number of simultaneous viewers. And then finally, if you have these silos, or even if you have a good content management system with bad metadata, you have a searchability problem. You might be able to solve the problem of going from 500 hours to 10,000 hours, but if you've done that and there's no metadata, there's no discovery system, now you have a big problem because you've created this thing that is so difficult to wade through that no one's going to sort of personally tolerate a needle in a haystack kind of discovery system. So you need something that generates metadata that doesn't require human curation. You can't have people have to invest minutes or even hours of time after they create some piece of content that they expected to take 15 minutes. Somebody's not going to spend an hour decorating that with slide timings and putting in metadata and manually transcribing it. You have to have a way to get to scale but also create searchable content kind of out of the gate. So you need to have automatic metadata generation. You have to have the ability to capture slide timings, to be able to extract slide text. To generate machine transcriptions and human transcriptions, and to have all of that happen without people really spending any additional curation time. So when you have all of these things, you can do some pretty radical stuff, and you can do it for kind of amazing levels of investment. Things that would have been, what would it cost to do one event, suddenly becomes what does it cost to have everybody in the organization be able to record something whenever they want and distribute it searchably to anybody else. So So one of our big kind of early success stories was in high finance. It was with New York Stock Exchange, Euronext. And we sort of tapped into this latent demand for video as a low friction, small audience mode of communication. So anybody that was a subject matter expert wanted to be able to share sort of tribal knowledge with other people who wanted to consume that. So a good example is, let's say that somebody is maintaining a software system where they're the expert on the particular piece of architecture. If you have somebody new joining that team, and maybe they're joining the team from a remote location, to be able to do that knowledge transfer between the expert and the person who's trying to learn it, that's a real challenge. And a lot of organizations solve this by flying people around, by having live training sessions. But to be able to just capture something, put it in the can, and distribute it out, that sort of changed how they did knowledge transfer. But that wasn't the only use case. They used it for executive communication. The CEO of NYSE Technologies actually did his own recordings from his desk and sent those out to the company. So that level of comfort with working with media, he wasn't sort of backed by a big AV staff who was sort of helping him through every step. It was just a guy at his desk saying, I'm going to talk to the company about the issues facing us for this quarter, and send it out to everybody. So enabling new use cases and enabling users who would not be the kind of traditional creators of media in the enterprise, that's actually what happened at NYSE, and it happened entirely organically. We weren't sort of pushing this use case on them. They came to it on their own. Another good example is Hospital Corporation of America. It's a distributed company. They have 140 hospitals in a chain in the United States. And one of the problems that they sort of talked to us about when we first approached them was we need some way to have a shared culture in the company, to actually have some sort of coordination between the different offices and to be able to have basically mass company culture. So they began doing live broadcasts of regular events, and the broadcasts were carried to every satellite office, and anybody that wanted to could watch them live, or they could play them back on demand. And what happened was they sort of started off with the traditional high-end use cases and walked further and further down as they realized that anybody with a computer could do this. So HCA is now one of the biggest and most prolific creators of content in the enterprise out of all Panopto customers. And they're just sort of using it as another communication mode alongside documents and email. So it just became sort of as natural as writing an email to people at HCA. And then finally, this is one of my favorite use cases. We've been doing a pilot with Siemens, and they decided that they were going to go directly into the nightmare scenario. They had a multi-track event that they were going to host with 40 guest speakers, each using their own computer. There was minimal prep time. They didn't really have any AV equipment, and they just decided they were going to kind of do it on the cheap and bootstrap it. And so they wrote this glowing report when they were done, where what they did was they gave each instructor, or each presenter before they came, instructions to install the Panopto recorder on their laptop and just walk them through how to join a recording session. And so every room had a camera set up in the back of the room, and they set up recording sessions for each individual presentation. And so the speakers would open their computer, they would connect to the existing recording session, and they would submit their screen and their slides as part of the timeline. And what ended up happening was that they had a near 100% success rate capturing all this content, and what came out the other end was not just video recordings of the presentations, fully slide synchronized, fully searchable presentations within 5 minutes after every talk ended. So there was zero post-production time. They went from recording a multi-track event to having the entire event online for the participants to go home and watch that night, for people who were remote and couldn't make it to be able to watch on their own. And they did it with basically no additional human time beyond just the cost, the sort of time of the presentations. So we think these are some great examples of use cases where there's a whole lot of demand in the enterprise, and education has been solving these problems for 5-10 years now, and they've gotten to scale that would make an AV expert at a big company sort of blush. So that's what we do. And I think this is one of those sort of interesting spaces where education actually has something to teach enterprise and has been operating at a level of sophistication and a level of reliability where very few things are lost because presenters don't really tolerate that, professors don't really tolerate that kind of thing when they give a great lecture. And I guess it's a case where the two worlds see perceived differences that don't exist. They're differences of terminology and not of use case. So I realize this is kind of a controversial thing, so that's the presentation, and if anybody wants to talk about it, we can spend time on discussion. All right, I guess let's go drink is what I'm supposed to say now, right?